They called him Dominic Volkov, and in this city, the name alone was enough to empty a room. Men who had stared down gun barrels without blinking would find a reason to leave the moment he entered a building. Rivals who once boasted about their own ruthlessness spoke of him only in whispers, and only when they were certain no one else could hear. It was said that he had built his empire not through luck or inheritance, but through a will so absolute that anyone who stood against him simply ceased to be an obstacle, one way or another. The police did not investigate him. The politicians did not cross him. The other families did not test him twice, because the ones who had tried once had not survived to try again. Fear was the only currency that mattered in his world, and Dominic Volkov had more of it than any man alive. His home matched his reputation in every way. The mansion sat at the end of a long private road, surrounded by iron gates and stone walls that had not been breached in over a decade. Guards patrolled the grounds in rotating shifts, their eyes sharp, their weapons never far from reach, radios crackling low against their collars through the small hours of the night. Inside, the halls were long and cold, floored in dark polished marble and lined with portraits of ancestors no one on staff dared ask about. Every room seemed built to remind visitors of their own smallness, from the towering ceilings to the heavy drapery that swallowed sound before it could ever carry too far. Even the staff who had worked there for years still felt a chill pass through them whenever they crossed into the West Wing, where Dominic kept his private study, as though the air itself grew heavier the closer one came to that door. Among that staff was a woman named Elena, who had been hired 8 months earlier through a recommendation no one quite remembered giving, passed along in the quiet way such things were arranged in circles like this one. She was quiet, diligent, and careful in a way that suggested she had learned caution the hard way, long before she ever set foot inside these gates. She rose before dawn each morning and worked until the house went dark each night, moving through her duties with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that being noticed by the wrong person could end badly, could end everything. She was there to pay off a debt left behind by her late father, a debt owed to men who did not forgive easily and collected in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork or courts. The wages from this house were the only ones large enough to make any real dent in what remained, and so she stayed, month after month, telling herself it was temporary. She told herself this every single day, the way a person repeats a prayer they are no longer sure they believe. The other staff had given her the rules within her first week, delivered in the hushed, urgent tone of people passing along a survival manual rather than a job description. Never speak unless spoken to. Never enter a room without knocking, even one that appeared empty. Never let him see you idle, not even for a moment, not even when you thought no one was watching. And above all, never, under any circumstances, disturb Mr. Volkov when he was in his study, whether the door stood open or closed, whether it was noon or the middle of the night. The rules were not written down anywhere. They did not need to be. Everyone in that house understood, without ever needing an example, that breaking them carried a cost no one wanted to calculate. You'll learn the rhythm of it, the head housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Marta, had told her on her first day, walking her briskly through the West Wing corridor. He keeps a schedule. Meals at certain hours. The study from 10 until whenever he decides otherwise. You learn where he'll be and you make sure you are somewhere else. That's the whole trick to lasting here. And if I can't avoid him? Elena had asked, her voice barely above a whisper even then. Marta had given her a long, measuring look. Then you keep your eyes down, you answer only what's asked, and you pray it's over quickly. She had not elaborated further, and Elena had not asked her to. There had been a story, told to her in fragments over her first few weeks by a kitchen girl named Priya who liked to talk more than the others thought was wise, about a groundskeeper who had once left a side gate unlocked overnight. No one in the house would say exactly what happened to him afterward, only that he had not returned to collect his final pay, and that his name was never spoken again within these walls. Elena did not know if the story was true in every detail, or if it had grown taller with each retelling the way such stories often did, but she had not needed much convincing regardless. She had grown up around men who dealt in debts and consequences, men not so different in kind from the one who now signed her paychecks, and she understood instinctively that the shape of the danger here was real even if that particular story wasn't. Her brother, Matteo, was the reason she endured it. He was 16, still in school, still believing, in the stubborn way of teenagers, that things would work out if you simply kept moving forward. Their father had died owing money to people who did not forget, and their mother had left long before that, for reasons Elena had stopped trying to untangle years ago. It had fallen to Elena, at 23, to hold together what remained of their family, and this job, terrifying as it was, paid enough to keep the collectors from their door and enough, some months, to set a little aside besides. She thought of Matteo often during her shifts, of the small kitchen table where he did his homework, of the promise she had made herself that whatever it cost her personally, he would never have to know men like the ones who had once come looking for their father. Elena had followed those rules faithfully for 8 months, and in that time she had perfected the art of disappearing into a side hallway the moment she heard his footsteps on the marble, of finishing a room's cleaning well before he was ever expected to set foot near it, of existing within the mansion as something closer to a shadow than a person. She ate her meals in the kitchen with the rest of the staff, kept her opinions to herself, and sent most of what she earned back to the small apartment where her younger brother waited for her, doing what he could to keep them both afloat while she worked. It had kept her safe. It had kept her employed. It had kept her, she told herself on the hardest nights, alive in every sense that mattered. Tonight, that careful equilibrium was about to be tested in a way she never could have anticipated. The meeting had been called for 8 o'clock, and word of it had moved through the household staff hours before the first car arrived, carried in low, anxious tones between the kitchen and the laundry room. It was not an ordinary meeting. The heads of 3 other families were coming, along with their own men, their own guns, their own long histories of grievance and alliance that shifted more often than anyone could keep track of. By 9 o'clock the entire ground floor had transformed into something closer to a war room than a home, the grand dining hall filled with men in dark suits whose voices stayed low and clipped, whose eyes tracked every door and every servant who dared to enter with a tray of drinks. The air itself seemed to thicken with the kind of tension that made even the most experienced staff move with exaggerated care, terrified of drawing attention at the wrong moment. Elena had been told, firmly, to remain in the kitchen wing until the meeting concluded, and she had obeyed without question, listening to the muffled rise and fall of voices through the thick walls, unable to make out the words but entirely able to feel the danger woven through their rhythm. Once, a voice rose sharply enough to carry, a single furious syllable that cut through the low hum like a blade, and every person in the kitchen froze at the sound of it, hands stilled over half-finished tasks, eyes darting toward the door as though it might swing open at any second. It did not. A moment later, the low hum resumed, and the kitchen slowly exhaled and returned to its work. Marta had gone in twice to refresh the drink service, and each time she returned her face gave away a little more of what she'd witnessed without her ever saying a single word about it directly. "They're testing him," she murmured the second time, mostly to herself, setting an empty tray down with hands that were not quite steady. "The Kessler family always tests him this way, pushing on the shipping routes, seeing how far he'll let it go before he pushes back." She caught Priya's wide eyes and seemed to remember herself. "Back to work, both of you. It isn't our business what happens in that room, only that the room looks presentable when they're gone." Elena had learned enough, in 8 months, to piece together the shape of the world Dominic Volkov ruled over, even without anyone explaining it to her directly. She knew the syndicate was not one organization but several, loosely bound by old agreements and older grudges, and that Volkov sat somewhere near the top of that fragile architecture, powerful enough that the other families needed his cooperation but ambitious enough, each of them, to want more of what he held for themselves. She knew that meetings like tonight's were where those tensions were managed rather than resolved, and that a bad night in that dining hall could mean funerals within the week for people whose names she would never learn. She kept her head down and did not let herself think too hard about any of it, because thinking too hard about the machinery of this house was its own kind of danger, and she had enough danger of her own to manage without borrowing more. It was well past midnight when the last of the cars finally pulled away from the estate, their headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window before vanishing down the long drive. The guards resumed their perimeter checks, and the house settled into an exhausted quiet that felt less like peace and more like the aftermath of something narrowly survived. That was when the real work began for the staff who remained. The dining hall looked as though a storm had passed directly through it. Glasses lay overturned across the long table, their contents pooling into the wood grain if left too long. Papers had been scattered and left behind, some crumpled, some torn entirely in half. A chair near the far wall had been knocked over and broken at one leg, a detail no one commented on aloud, though everyone understood exactly what kind of argument left a chair in that condition. Elena was handed a checklist by Marta, whose eyes were as tired as her own but whose voice remained clipped and businesslike, a professional armor against the lateness of the hour. "The private wing needs to be spotless by morning," Marta said, pressing the list into Elena's hands. "Mr. Volkov has another meeting at 9. He won't want to see any trace of tonight left behind, not so much as a wrinkle in a tablecloth." "Understood?" "Understood," Elena said, though she could not quite keep the exhaustion from creeping into her voice. Marta softened, just slightly, the way she sometimes did when no one else was close enough to notice. "Go home the moment it's done, don't linger over anything that isn't on that list. I'll square it with the morning shift if you're a few minutes late clocking out." It was as close to kindness as the house usually allowed itself, and Elena took it for what it was. "Thank you," Elena said, and she meant it, because she understood better than most exactly what was at stake in a house like this one, and she was grateful, in whatever small way circumstances allowed, that Marta seemed to understand it too. She took the list and got to work without another word. By 2 in the morning, her feet had gone from a dull ache to something closer to numbness, a strange buzzing pain that traveled up through her calves every time she knelt to scrub a stain from the carpet or reach beneath a piece of furniture. Her eyes burned with the particular exhaustion of a double shift, the kind where the edges of a room seemed to blur faintly no matter how hard she tried to focus on the task directly in front of her. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours by then, running on little more than a few cups of weak coffee and the sheer necessity of finishing the work in front of her. She thought, not for the first time that night, of how much longer she could sustain this pace before something in her simply gave out entirely. She pushed through anyway, because that was what she did, because it was what 8 months of survival in this house had trained her to do without question. Room by room, she erased the evidence of the night's tension. She wiped down the long table until it gleamed under the low light, resetting the chairs into their precise formation as though the meeting had never happened at all. She gathered the discarded papers into a neat stack for someone else to sort through in the morning, careful not to glance at anything written on them, because in this house, knowing too much was its own kind of danger. Her arms moved on instinct now, her mind floating somewhere just outside her own body, tethered only by the dull, insistent throb of fatigue that kept reminding her, again and again, that she was still awake, still upright, still functioning on nothing but stubborn will. By the time she reached the private wing, the house had gone almost eerily silent around her. The guards who typically patrolled the interior corridors had stepped outside to walk the grounds, their presence needed more urgently beyond the walls than within them tonight, leaving the halls empty and still in a way that felt almost unnatural. Even the usual creak and hum of an old mansion seemed to have quieted entirely, as though the building itself were holding its breath alongside her. Elena moved through the dim light of a single hallway sconce, her cart squeaking softly against the marble floor, painfully aware of how loud every small sound became in the total absence of anything else to mask it. Not far away, in his private study, Dominic Volkov sat alone with his head in his hands. The meeting had gone as well as could be expected, which was to say it had nearly ended in bloodshed twice before he'd managed to steer the room back towards something resembling business. He'd spent the better part of 3 hours playing a version of himself that the room required and expected, unshakable, merciless, utterly without doubt or hesitation, and now that the mask had come off in the privacy of his own study, what remained underneath felt heavier than it usually did. He pressed his fingers into his temples, trying to massage away a tension that had settled somewhere behind his eyes hours ago and showed no sign of loosening on its own. There were nights, more of them lately than he cared to admit, when the weight of everything he'd built pressed down on him so completely that he found himself wondering, briefly and privately, what it might feel like to simply put it down. He never let the thought last long. Men in his position did not have the luxury of rest, and he had learned a long time ago that dwelling on what he couldn't have only made the wanting worse. He rose from his desk and made his way toward the small library adjoining his study, intending to pour himself a drink from the cabinet kept there for exactly nights like this one. His steps were quiet out of long habit rather than any particular necessity, the same instinctive caution that had kept him alive through years that should have killed him many times over. The house was dark, and he preferred it that way at this hour, no meaningless small talk to endure, no need to arrange his face into anything performative for an audience. Just silence, and the promise of a few minutes entirely alone before he'd have to become someone else again in the morning, for the next meeting, and the one after that, and all the ones that would inevitably follow. He had inherited this life at 22, far younger than most men in his position, when his father had been gunned down outside a restaurant 2 blocks from this very estate. There had been no time for grief in the way other people understood it, no space carved out for mourning a man who had, in his own way, been as feared and as merciless as Dominic himself would eventually become. There had only been the immediate, brutal necessity of proving himself before the vultures circling the family's territory could pick it apart piece by piece. He had done what needed doing. He had built a reputation on the foundation of that first terrible year, and every year since had only added another layer of stone to a wall he was no longer certain he knew how to climb back down from, even if he wanted to. There were nights, rare and unwelcome, when he let himself wonder what might have happened if his father had lived longer, if the transition had come more slowly, if he'd had the chance to become someone before the city forced him to become something instead. He did not indulge those thoughts often. They served no purpose beyond reminding him of a version of himself that no longer existed and likely never really had. Tonight, exhausted from 3 hours of controlled brinkmanship in his own dining hall, the thought crept in anyway, uninvited, the way it sometimes did in the hour just before dawn when his guard was thinnest. Elena had entered the library only minutes before him, tasked with a final round of dusting before she could finally consider her shift complete for the night. She'd worked through the shelves methodically, cloth in hand, moving along the long rows of leather-bound books that no one in the house seemed to actually read but that Mr. Volkov insisted on keeping in pristine condition regardless. Her body had been running on fumes for hours by that point, and by the time she reached the thick rug near the center of the room, her legs simply refused to carry her any further without a moment's rest, no matter how firmly she tried to command them. She told herself it would be brief. Just a minute, she thought, lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the rug, her back finding the solid, steadying support of a bookshelf behind her. Just enough time to let the sharp ache in her feet subside before finishing the last of her tasks and finally allowing herself to go home and collapse into her own narrow bed. She closed her eyes, meaning only to rest them for a moment, meaning only to breathe. The "just a minute" dissolved instantly and completely into something far deeper than she ever intended. Her body, having reached the absolute end of what it could give after 20 hours of unbroken labor, simply shut down without asking her permission. Within moments she had slipped into a sleep so total that the cleaning cloth remained loosely curled in her hand, her head tilted gently against the shelf, her breathing slow and even in a way it hadn't been in weeks, maybe longer. Dominic stepped into the library a short while later, his mind still turning over the events of the night's meeting, and stopped abruptly at the threshold. There was a shape on the floor near the far bookshelf, low and still, half shrouded in the deep shadow cast by the tall bookcase. Every instinct he'd spent years sharpening surged to life at once, sharp and immediate. His hand moved automatically toward his side, his entire body going rigid with the readiness of a man who had survived exactly this kind of moment before, in exactly this kind of darkness, more than once in his life. An intruder, his mind supplied instantly. An assassin waiting patiently for the house to empty, for the guards to step outside, for exactly this window of vulnerability. He crossed the room without a sound, each step deliberate and controlled, his eyes locked on the still form as he prepared himself for violence, his pulse steady even as his focus narrowed to a fine point. He reached the edge of the rug and looked down, and the tension in his shoulders did not immediately release, because what he saw did not make sense to him at first glance. A woman. Curled small against the base of the shelf, utterly unmoving, utterly unaware of his presence looming above her. He crouched slightly, letting the pale moonlight through the tall windows fall fully across her face, and only then did recognition finally settle in, slow and strange. It was the maid. The quiet one who always seemed to vanish before he could ever get a proper look at her, who kept her eyes down and her voice softer than a whisper whenever their paths happened to cross in a hallway or a doorway. He realized, with something like mild surprise, that he did not even know her name, though he had seen her face in passing dozens of times over the past several months. She was fast asleep, the cleaning cloth still loosely gripped in one hand as though she had simply lost the fight to stay conscious mid-task, her chest rising and falling in the slow, deep rhythm of someone who had fallen not into rest but into total collapse. He straightened, and for a long moment he simply stood there, watching her, the drink he'd come for entirely forgotten. Every part of him that had built an empire on fear expected the next feeling to be anger. Sleeping on duty, in his private library, mere feet from where he'd been sitting only minutes ago in his own study, it was the kind of carelessness that, in anyone else's house, might have ended a person's employment on the spot, or worse. He had ended relationships, business and otherwise, over smaller lapses than this one. He waited for that familiar heat to rise in his chest, the one that had made grown men beg for their lives on more than one occasion. It didn't come. Instead, as he looked more closely, something else crept in entirely uninvited. Her face, even in sleep, carried the marks of exhaustion so deep it seemed etched permanently into her skin, faint shadows beneath her eyes, a paleness that spoke of too many hours without enough food or genuine rest. Her hands, loosely curled near her chest, bore the small calluses and reddened knuckles of someone who scrubbed floors and polished silver for a living, who had likely never known a single day without hard physical labor behind it. A slight shiver moved through her shoulders as the cool library air settled over her, and she curled instinctively tighter against the cold without ever waking, a small unconscious motion that struck him more than he expected it to. Dominic felt something shift quietly inside his chest that he did not have a name for and was not entirely sure he wanted one. He had spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, loyalty bought with fear, respect built on threat, alliances that existed only until the moment they became inconvenient to maintain, that he had almost forgotten what it looked like when someone simply existed in front of him without any calculation behind it at all. She wasn't performing exhaustion for his benefit, because she had no idea he was even in the room. There was nothing transactional in the way her small frame had given out from sheer physical limit, nothing in it that asked anything of him whatsoever. It was, in its own strange and unremarkable way, the most honest thing he had encountered in longer than he could remember. A protectiveness he did not recognize in himself rose up quietly but insistently, startling him more than any threat ever had in his adult life. He thought about waking her. He thought about the sharp words that would send her scrambling to her feet in terror, the kind of reaction he was well accustomed to inspiring in the people around him, staff and rivals alike. He found, standing there in the moonlight looking down at her, that he had absolutely no interest in seeing that particular fear directed at her, not tonight, not for something as small as this. Instead, he made a decision that surprised even himself more than it would have surprised anyone else who knew him. He would not wake her. She had worked enough tonight, more than enough, if the state of her hands and the sheer depth of her exhaustion were any real indication of the hours she'd already put in before this moment. Whatever unspoken punishment his own household rules might have technically demanded for a lapse like this, he found he simply had no interest in enforcing it. Not on her. Not tonight, and if he were honest with himself, probably not ever. He crouched down beside her, moving with a care that felt strange and unfamiliar in hands more accustomed to violence than gentleness, and carefully slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her shoulders, bracing himself before lifting. She stirred faintly at the change in position, murmuring something too soft and indistinct to make out, but did not wake, her body simply adjusting and settling against the new support without any real awareness of what was happening. He lifted her slowly, adjusting his hold until her weight settled naturally against his chest, her head tucking almost instinctively into the curve of his shoulder as though she'd done it 100 times before. She was lighter than he expected her to be, which only made the sharp calluses on her hands and the visible strain around her eyes feel like clearer evidence of just how hard she pushed herself day after day, rather than any real measure of her size or frailty. For a moment he simply stood there in the library, holding her, caught by the strange, almost dissonant contrast of it all, a man capable of ending lives without so much as a flicker of hesitation, cradling a sleeping woman with a gentleness that felt as though it belonged to some entirely different version of himself. He could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet, steady and unhurried in a way it rarely was even in his calmest moments, and somewhere beneath that steadiness sat a feeling he did not examine too closely, because he suspected, even then, that he would not like what he found if he looked directly at it. He carried her from the library and out into the quiet, dimly lit corridors beyond, his footsteps deliberately unhurried despite her weight. The house at this hour belonged entirely to the two of them, every other soul either asleep in some distant wing or stationed outside along the perimeter wall, and the effect was strange, almost dreamlike, the long marble hallway stretching ahead of him lit only by the low amber glow of the wall sconces spaced every few meters apart. His own reflection caught briefly in a darkened window as he passed, and he barely recognized the man looking back at him, a powerful stranger carrying something fragile through his own house in the dead of night. He passed the narrow staircase that led down to the cramped servant quarters, where he knew, from a facilities report he had once glanced at in passing and mostly forgotten, that the heating rarely reached the far rooms properly, even in the depths of winter. He thought, briefly and with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, of how many nights she must have spent in a room like that, curled beneath thin blankets after shifts exactly like this one, with no one waiting up to notice how tired she truly was. He did not take that path. Some part of him recoiled instinctively at the thought of setting her down in a cold, cramped room after everything her body had already been through tonight, as though doing so would somehow undo whatever fragile thing had already begun to shift inside him in the library. Instead, without fully examining the decision, he turned toward the east wing, toward the part of the house that belonged only to him, that no one else in the household was ever permitted to enter without his direct summons. He passed his own study on the way, the door standing ajar exactly as he'd left it, the desk still cluttered with the papers from tonight's meeting, evidence of a life he would have to return to fully in a matter of hours. For now, none of it mattered. For the length of this one quiet walk down an empty hallway, he was not the man the city feared, only a man carrying someone who needed carrying, and he found he did not particularly want the walk to end. He brought her into his own bedroom, a space no member of the household staff had ever once been allowed to see beyond its threshold. The room was large and warm, secured by the same iron discipline that guarded every other part of his life, and utterly unlike anything he imagined she had ever known in her own circumstances. He crossed to the bed and laid her down with a gentleness that felt almost foreign in his own hands, easing her onto the mattress with slow, deliberate care, mindful not to jostle her from whatever fragile rest she'd finally managed to find after so many hours of forcing herself upright. He knelt beside the bed and slipped off her worn shoes, setting them neatly on the floor beside the frame, and then drew the heavy duvet up over her shoulders, tucking it close around her the way one might for a child who had fallen asleep somewhere they were never supposed to be. He stood back afterward and studied her for a long moment in the low light. The tension that had followed her even into sleep seemed to be loosening gradually now, her breathing settling into something even deeper and more peaceful, her face finally, fully at rest for what he suspected might be the first time in a very long while. He told himself he would leave. There was no reason to stay, no purpose that made any real sense within the framework of the life he had built for himself, brick by brick, threat by threat, over more years than he liked to count. And yet he found himself crossing to the armchair positioned near the window instead of the door, lowering himself into it slowly, watching her from across the room in a silence that felt, strangely, less empty than any silence he could remember experiencing in years. He did not entirely understand why he stayed. He only knew that something about watching her rest, safe and warm and utterly unaware of the storm she had unknowingly wandered into, gave him a quiet he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit even to himself. The house around them remained still. The guards continued their rounds outside, unaware of anything unusual within. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a clock ticked on toward morning, and Dominic Volkov sat in the dark and watched a sleeping maid breathe, and found, for reasons he could not fully articulate, that he did not want to be anywhere else. He thought, at one point, of all the years that had led him to this chair. The father who had taught him that weakness was the only true sin. The men who had tried to take everything from him before he was old enough to understand what he stood to lose. The slow, grinding accumulation of power that had cost him every soft edge he might have once possessed, until fear became the only language he spoke fluently anymore. He had built a life in which no one got close enough to see him like this, tired, unguarded, sitting quietly in the dark simply because he did not want to leave. He was not entirely sure what to make of the fact that a stranger's exhaustion had cracked something open in him that a decade of solitude had not. So he stayed, and the hours passed slowly, and somewhere in that stillness he allowed himself, for what felt like the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, to simply be still alongside someone else without expecting anything in return. At some point, well past 3, she shifted in her sleep and murmured something indistinct, her brow furrowing briefly as though some old worry had followed her even into unconsciousness. Without quite deciding to, he had reached over and found her hand where it lay atop the duvet, meaning only to still whatever small distress had crossed her face. The furrow smoothed almost immediately at the contact, her fingers curling loosely around his own a moment later, an unconscious response that undid something in his chest more thoroughly than any threat ever had. He should have withdrawn his hand then. He told himself he would, in a minute, once he was certain she had settled fully back into rest. The minute passed, and then another, and he found he had no real intention of following through on the promise he'd made to himself. He thought, watching her in the low light, of how strange it was that a house built entirely on the architecture of fear could still contain a room where someone slept this peacefully, this completely, simply because they had finally been allowed to stop. He wondered how long it had been since she'd last slept without setting some part of herself on alert, without holding some fraction of her attention in reserve for whatever demand might come next. He suspected, from the depth of her rest now, that it had been a very long time indeed, and the thought settled into him with a weight he had not expected a stranger's exhaustion to carry. Morning arrived slowly, gray light giving way gradually to gold as the sun rose over the estate, streaming eventually through the heavy curtains he had not bothered to close all the way the night before. The light found her face first, warm and gradual, pulling her up from the depths of sleep in a manner far gentler than anything that usually managed to wake her. Elena woke slowly, her body wrapped in a warmth so complete and unfamiliar that for a moment she simply floated in it, unwilling and unable to question where it came from. The sheets against her skin were softer than anything she had ever owned, cool silk that whispered against her rather than the scratchy, thin fabric she was accustomed to. She became aware, gradually and then all at once, that she was not in her narrow servant's bed, not beneath the thin blanket she used to fight off the winter drafts that crept through the gaps in her window frame. Her eyes opened fully, and the room around her slid into focus, wide, opulent, unmistakably not hers in any sense. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath clean out of her chest. She knew this room. She had glimpsed it once or twice, briefly, from the hallway, on the rare occasions she had been sent to deliver something to the door of Mr. Volkov's private quarters and told firmly to leave it just outside. This was his bedroom. She was in his bed. The last clear memory she had was of the library, of sitting down on that rug for just 1 minute, of her eyes growing too heavy to hold open any longer. Everything after that point was a total blank, and the blank frightened her far more than any clear memory could have. Panic rose in her chest so fast it nearly stole her breath entirely. She had fallen asleep on duty. She had fallen asleep in his private library, inside his own home, breaking the one rule that everyone had warned her, again and again, over and over, was absolute and unforgivable. And now she had woken up somewhere she had no memory of coming to, in a bed that belonged to the single most feared man in the entire city. Every possibility that raced through her mind in that instant felt worse than the last. She would be fired without warning. She would be punished in ways she did not want to let herself imagine in any detail. She would lose the wages that stood as the only thing between her family and the debt that threatened, always, to swallow them whole. Her mind raced ahead of her, sketching out disasters faster than she could examine any of them properly. She thought of Matteo coming home to an empty apartment with no explanation. She thought of the collectors who had once come looking for her father, and what men like that might do if the money simply stopped arriving 1 month without warning. She thought of Marta's face, of the quiet kindness in it hours earlier, and wondered whether that kindness would curdle into something colder once she learned where Elena had actually spent the remainder of the night. None of it made sense yet, none of it had any solid shape, but her body reacted to the uncertainty exactly as it always had, flooding her limbs with the old, familiar readiness to run, to apologize, to make herself as small as circumstances required in order to survive whatever came next. She became aware, distantly, that her heart was pounding hard enough to feel in her throat, and that some part of her was already rehearsing the apology she would need to deliver the moment she saw him, the explanation that might, if she was fortunate, be enough to keep her position, or at the very least keep her out of real danger. She had survived 8 months in this house by anticipating exactly this kind of catastrophe before it arrived and meeting it with total, immediate compliance. She did not know yet that this particular catastrophe would refuse to follow the script she'd already prepared for it. She moved to bolt upright, some deep instinct screaming at her to get out of the bed immediately, to explain herself, to beg if that was what it took to salvage anything of her situation, but she got no further than lifting her shoulders from the mattress before something stopped her cold. A weight, warm and solid, was anchoring her right hand firmly to the mattress. She looked down, and her breath caught entirely in her throat. Her fingers were laced tightly together with his. Dominic Volkov's hand held hers with a firmness that was neither accidental nor careless, his fingers curled protectively around her own as though he had been holding on, deliberately, and without interruption, for quite some time already. She followed the line of his arm upward with wide, disbelieving eyes, past the armchair he had clearly spent the entire night sitting in, to his face. He was already awake. He had been watching her, she realized with a fresh jolt of alarm, for who knew how long, his expression carrying none of the coldness the entire city so feared and whispered about. His eyes, when they finally met hers directly, held something soft, something quiet and entirely unguarded, a warmth she had never once, in 8 months of careful observation, seen directed at anyone within these walls. There was no anger written across his face. There was no judgment waiting to fall the moment she moved or spoke. There was only a steady, careful gentleness, as though he understood exactly how afraid she must be in this moment and had absolutely no intention of adding to that fear. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice low and rough with the hour, before she could manage to say anything at all. "You collapsed in the library last night. I didn't want to wake you." Elena stared at him, unable to form a response, her mind still scrambling to reconcile the man in front of her with every warning she had ever been given about him. I'm so sorry," she finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper, her fingers instinctively tightening around his despite the fear still coursing through her. "I didn't mean to. I was only going to rest for a moment, I swear, I didn't." "I know," he said simply, cutting off the frantic apology before it could build into something larger. "You've done nothing wrong here. You were exhausted. That isn't a crime in this house, whatever anyone might have told you." He paused, watching the disbelief flicker openly across her face, and something in his own expression softened further, if that were even possible. "I should have noticed sooner how hard they've been running you. That falls on me, not on you." She did not know what to say to that. In 8 months, no one in this house had ever once suggested that her exhaustion was anyone's responsibility but her own to manage and hide. She looked down again at their joined hands, at the strange, quiet reality of the situation settling over her slowly, replacing panic with something far more confusing and far harder to name. "Why did you stay?" she finally asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, too tired and too disoriented to filter herself the way 8 months of careful survival had trained her to. Dominic considered the question for a long moment, his thumb moving once, slowly, along the back of her hand in a small and wordless kind of reassurance. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, and there was something almost startling in the honesty of it, coming from a man who never admitted uncertainty to anyone. "I only knew I didn't want to leave." Neither of them spoke again for a while after that. Words felt unnecessary in the strange, quiet space that had opened up between them, the terror she had carried into that room dissolving slowly and steadily under the weight of his hand around hers, replaced gradually by something she didn't yet have a proper name for, something that felt dangerously, unexpectedly close to safety. She had spent 8 months believing, with absolute certainty, that the man behind that study door was the single greatest danger in her entire life. Looking at him now, in the quiet gold light of morning, with her fingers still held gently and deliberately in his, she understood for the first time that she might have been wrong about him, or at least wrong about some essential part of him that no one else had ever been permitted to see. "I still have my duties," she said eventually, some old instinct pulling her back toward the familiar shape of her routine, even as she made no real move to leave the bed. "Marta will be looking for me. If she finds out Marta answers to me," Dominic said, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of dry humor entering his voice for the first time. "You'll take the morning. I'll make sure of it." Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly at that, a tension she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what it felt like without it. "Thank you," she said softly, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could really convey. He did not let go of her hand, not yet, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not particularly want him to. The city outside those tall windows still feared him, and would go on fearing him for a long time yet. The empire he ruled still ran, as it always had, on threat and calculated violence and the absolute certainty that crossing him meant an end no one wanted to face. None of that would change tomorrow, or the day after, or likely for a very long time to come. But in this one room, in this one quiet, golden morning, something had shifted permanently and irreversibly between the ruthless boss and the maid who had once tried so hard, for so many months, to remain entirely invisible to him. She was not invisible to him anymore. She understood now, with a clarity that startled her, that she likely never would be again. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, unable to stop herself, still half-braced for some catch she hadn't yet seen coming, some cost that would inevitably reveal itself once the softness of the morning wore off. "Now," Dominic said, his voice steady and unusually gentle, "you rest. The rest we can figure out together, when you're ready." She studied his face for a long moment, searching, out of 8 months of hard-won instinct, for the calculation she was certain must be hiding somewhere beneath the gentleness. She did not find it. What she found instead was something closer to uncertainty, an unfamiliar hesitance in a man the entire city agreed never hesitated over anything. "People are going to talk," she said carefully. "The staff. If they see us like this, if Marta." "Let them talk," Dominic said, and there was no performance in the words, no bravado meant for an audience that wasn't there to hear it. "I've spent a great many years making sure people were too afraid to say anything true about me at all. I find I don't mind very much if this is the thing they finally have to whisper about." A faint, disbelieving laugh escaped her before she could stop it, quiet and rusty, as though it had been a long time since she'd had reason to use it. "That isn't the answer I expected." "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine it is." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb still moving in that same slow, absent rhythm along the back of her hand. "I've built a great deal in this city, Elena." He said her name carefully, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth for the first time, and she realized with a small jolt that she had never actually told it to him, that he must have learned it from someone else, or perhaps had simply always known. Respect, fear, obedience. All of it built to last, all of it built to keep people at exactly the distance I decided they should stay. I don't think I understood, until last night, how much I'd built it to keep myself at a distance too. She did not have a ready response to that, and so she said nothing, only let her fingers tighten slightly around his, an answer of a different kind entirely, one that did not require words to be understood. Outside the tall windows, the sounds of the estate were beginning to stir in earnest, a distant gate creaking open for the morning deliveries, the low murmur of the kitchen staff starting their day 2 floors below. The ordinary machinery of the house was resuming its rhythm, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place within these particular walls overnight. Soon enough, Elena knew, she would have to rise, to smooth her uniform, to walk back out into a house full of people who still believed they understood exactly what kind of man employed them. She was in no hurry to test that moment yet. "I should go," she said eventually, though she made no actual move toward the door, her hand still resting easily in his. "Before Marta sends someone looking." "In a minute," Dominic said, and the request was so unlike anything she imagined him capable of asking that she found herself smiling despite everything, despite the exhaustion still heavy in her limbs and the uncertainty still churning somewhere beneath her ribs. Just a minute longer. She thought, with a small flicker of dark humor she did not share aloud, that it was the second time in 12 hours someone in this house had asked for just one more minute, and that both times, the minute had turned into something considerably larger than either of them had planned for. She let herself settle back slightly against the pillows, in no real hurry now to test the hallway or Marta's watchful eye or the version of the house that existed beyond this room. There would be time enough for all of that soon, for the careful recalibration of a life that had shifted overnight in ways she was still only beginning to understand. For now there was only the warmth of the sheets, the steady weight of his hand around hers, and the quiet, astonishing fact that the man the entire city feared had spent his night keeping watch over her rest instead of demanding anything from it. Somewhere below them, the house continued its ordinary business, oblivious to the small revolution that had taken place within its walls. Pots clattered faintly in the distant kitchen. A car door closed somewhere near the gate. The world outside this room went on exactly as it always had, and would likely go on that way for a long time yet, indifferent to the particular quiet unfolding between a mafia boss and his maid on an ordinary golden morning. But within these four walls, something essential had been rearranged, gently and irrevocably, in the space of a single sleepless night, and neither of them was in any hurry to disturb it. "Elena," Dominic said, testing her name once more, as though he intended to use it often from now on. "Stay a little longer." She did. And as the morning light spread slowly across the room around them, warming the silk sheets and the polished floor and the two people sitting quietly together in the middle of it all, neither of them moved to break the stillness, or the grip of their joined hands, for a long while yet.